This is Logan for the NSF team meeting, doing a site check. Can you hear us there in Salt Lake?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you.
guys know what order you're going in? All right. I expect we'll see latecomers because we have a new location. I've already gotten one phone call from somebody who didn't know where to go. But let's go ahead and get started so we have enough time for both speakers. And before we launch in, I just wanted to confirm a couple of logistics things. We have some slots open for presentations still, especially in February. And there's a number of people who haven't presented yet. So I encourage people who haven't yet found a slot, and I've done this by email, but I'll do it again soon. Jack, that was the date you gave me, right? It was 31st? Do I recall? I'm going off of memory here. But I'd like to get as many people in as we can, but we are happy having one speaker per session. Gives us more time to interact and talk if we end up with that kind of schedule. We also scheduled retreat, that methods workshop or retreat on January 15th. And that's from, I think our calendar right now, Lauren, help me, 10 to 4:30 is our working agenda. We spent some time talking through the agenda. The model is to do two things. Number one, we'll try to bring human dimensions kind of systematically into our conversation. We've got some ideas of how to go about doing that. It'll include some coordinated presentations, maybe not, by some of the social science folks about methodology per se, but the way we're kind of excited about talking about it is a little bit bigger than that. We will also use that time to brainstorm possible topics and locations for focused project development later in the semester, but I think it might be helpful to us just starting around now to have a couple of candidate sites and emergent scientific puzzles or places and issues that we're interested in to focus our conversation so we can see how they relate. I don't think we should pick one. I don't think we should start writing a single thing at this point, but I think it might be useful. So we've structured some time for that exercise as well. It will be in the water lab, which we have reserved, and someone's got a key, right? I know that there are a number of you that have been there. And I think it's the third floor. Is that right, Jeff? Conference room. It's a nice conference room. So I'm hoping that almost everybody can make it. I've only heard from one person so far who can't, but try to make room for that on your busy live calendars. Okay, so with no further ado, I'll hand over the secret microphone so our people on the net can hear it.
I'm coordinated enough to do this. Yeah.
So the people outside, we've sent them the presentation slides. That will be a little later.
All right, I'm going to get going here. So I'm going to be speaking today about some of the research I've started over the last couple of years since I moved to Utah. Probably the last time most of you, if you have heard me speak about my research, it was mostly looking back to my postdoctoral and doctoral work when I came to interview. So since I've moved to this region, I've started a couple new lines of research which I think are relatively pertinent to the goals of our grant and our research group. So just to start off, giving you a visual image of the types of places I've been working in Utah since I moved here. I've been working quite a bit at the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge. I'm realizing maybe there isn't a laser pointer, but maybe I'll use the mouse here. And also I've been working in many of the state waterfowl management areas along the Great Salt Lake. In addition, I've been doing work up on Bear Lake and Utah Lake and Middle Button, great. Salt Creek waterfowl management area, and I've even ended up on the Green River. That picture's for you, Jack. Much of my work has been looking at the restoration and management of the native plant communities, particularly along the Great Salt Lake, such as communities dominated by alkali bulrush and similar species. But I've also been doing a lot of work with Phragmites, which is probably our most problematic invasive plant in northern Utah in our wetlands. So I'm going to speak today about two different research lines of research that I've been working on and some of the different collaborative projects within these. One line of research is looking at the mechanisms of Phragmites invasion in Utah, and I've got a couple different studies. I'm mostly talking about what we're doing right now. We don't actually have a lot of data on some of these yet, so I'm just going to kind of give you a sense of what the techniques and methodologies that we're using are. And also, some of my research questions looking at the effects of drought on wetland plant communities, and certainly our focus on water and drought and water scarcity is important, or these studies are important for that. So let's first start off with this remote sensing study I've been doing with Christopher Neal, Mac McKee, and David Rosenberg. So first of all, some of you may not be familiar with Phragmites at all. It's a very tall grass, and there's an introduced subspecies that was introduced from Europe that is highly invasive and is taking over wetlands in our, particularly in northern Utah. And one of the things we've been wondering about are what the impacts of different water levels are on the ability of Phragmites to spread over both short and long time scales. So for those of you who don't know about Phragmites and why we would even care about it, this is a shot from Utah Lake, and this is all Phragmites. So in many of our wetlands in this region, we're seeing a massive transformation of native-dominated wetland communities to just basically monotypic stands, gigantic stands of Phragmites, and it's because these wetlands are so important for the migratory birds along the Pacific and Central Flyway and other important wildlife species. We are seeing a great loss of wildlife habitat. So that's part of the motivations for why I'm even looking at Phragmites invasion. But one of the things we've been doing is taking a kind of long-term perspective and looking at how Phragmites cover has changed, either expanded or contracted over decadal timescales in conjunction with changes in water levels. And so part of this project is we're looking at historical imagery of Phragmites. We're particularly focusing on the Bear River Refuge for this project, and taking some of this is one of the images that Christopher Neal has collected and classified. So basically you can use some of the reflectance from green, it's green, red, and near infrared images. And you can basically see that some of these different plant communities actually have very different color classifications. And we can use that to actually classify what areas are Phragmites versus other native plants versus native plants of interest, and can kind of see how these have expanded and contracted over time. At the same time, we have been working with some of the new technology coming out of the Water Lab. Mac McKee and some of his colleagues have developed these UAVs, these unmanned aerial vehicles, and they can take very high resolution imagery, such that we can actually look at a particular stand of Phragmites and look at how it changes just on very short time scales. So we're talking on the order of maybe a few centimeters to meters within a year. So again, we're looking at how Phragmites is expanded or contracted in different units at the Bear River Refuge, and how it has changed in conjunction with flooded versus drawdown conditions. So why do we really care about this at all? First, we just need to have a general sense of what the rate of spread of this plant is. If we see it coming into a new area, how rapidly do we have to act before we can expect it to really take over? And also, I've been approached by a lot of different wetland managers wanting to know what are good control techniques for this plant species. And part of our questions are trying to understand, when does flooding versus drawdowns, when do these benefit versus help control Phragmites? So this is work that we're going to be continuing over the next few months, and you'll hopefully be seeing some of our results at some point here. But this is just kind of a highlight of one of the things I've been working on. A study that I'm just wrapping up now also relates to the mechanism of Phragmites spread in Utah, but it's more a genetic approach that I've been taking with Karen Mock, who is in Wildland Resources and is a molecular geneticist. So we're interested in understanding the mechanisms of spread of Phragmites. And for those of you let me go back for 1 sec. So this project is actually taking a comparison of introduced Phragmites versus native Phragmites. So I've already been talking about this introduced subspecies of Phragmites that's invasive, but there also actually is native Phragmites in Utah. And in fact, there is native Phragmites across North America, but co-occurring is this invasive subspecies that was introduced from Europe. As an ecologist, this presents a unique opportunity because I can actually compare how native Phragmites spreads compared to this introduced subspecies, and it gives us insights into the mechanism of what makes an introduced species become invasive. Why is this introduced subspecies of Phragmites so successful? So just to give you a sense, in Utah, where we have mostly non-native Phragmites, you can see these red dots going up here, mostly along the Great Salt Lake down to Utah Lake. There actually are, there's quite a bit up at Bear Lake as well. The green stars on that map are where native Phragmites has been found historically, and you might be able to see the different dates associated with these green stars. These are places where native Phragmites was collected, and we have herbarium records from these sampling collections. So how does native versus non-native Phragmites spread? Well, we're interested in both of these mechanisms. Both plants can actually spread by rhizomes. So this is clonal spread, which means it basically sends out stems either below ground, or on the case here from the shot at up at Bear Lake, the stems are running along the surface of the sand there, and it sends up shoots along the way. Here's a close-up of a few chunks of rhizomes that I collected for some experiments. At the same time, this plant produces millions and millions of seeds, both native and introduced. However, not all of those seeds are viable and able to be successful. So what I was wondering is, what is the relative contribution of spread by rhizomes versus seeds for native versus introduced Phragmites? And so these were our research objectives. One, looking at the extent of gene flow among populations of native versus introduced Phragmites. So this gives us a sense of how well mixed all these different populations are, and I'll get into that more in a minute. And again, then the relative contribution of that clonal spread by rhizomes versus seed dispersal. And I just realized that one thing I forgot to mention. So we're using genetic techniques and to be able to decipher between these. So if I collected a leaf from here and a leaf from here, they would be, and I genetically analyzed them, they'd be genetically identical. So that is the way that we can tell if something is coming from the same clone, because it has the exact same genetic signature. Versus if it's pollen is being spread around and it's outcrossing and producing seeds, we'd see a very different genetic signature from the leaves that we're collecting. So we went out and collected leaf samples from, in red here, these non-native Phragmites populations, and in yellow, these native ones. You'll see here at Utah Lake, we actually had native and introduced co-occurring, so we can make direct comparisons at those sites. And we laid out a bunch of transects and collected lots of leaves. And for those of you who are interested, we used AFLP for the most part to analyze our data, and in some cases microsatellite data. So I'm going to jump right into results and tell you what we found. So our first objective was to get a sense of how much gene flow there is among these populations. So these are results from an AMOVA, which is an analysis of molecular variance. So basically we're looking at kind of like geographic distance, the genetic distance among these different leaf samples. And we can look at the distances among our different individuals and leaf samples and classify them in terms of how much of the variation that we see in the genetics of these plants is found among populations versus within populations. And so for this first pie chart here for non-native Phragmites, you can see that the vast majority of the genetic variation is found within populations. So that tells me there's little structure among the populations, which basically means there's a lot of spread of pollen and seeds. And there's just not a lot of difference genetically among those different Phragmites that we collected across this broad spectrum. On the other hand, with native Phragmites, there actually was some amount of genetic structuring among populations, so it's telling me they're a little bit more isolated within this geographic range. And even when we corrected for geographic distance, we still found this differentiation. So I'll come back to that in a second. But to look at our second objective, how much of the spread is by rhizomes versus seeds? One of the first things we looked at was whether we had genetically identical individuals across our site. So that would mean that chunks of rhizomes would have spread from say, one side of Bear Lake to the other side of Bear Lake, or maybe among these sites along the Great Salt Lake. We actually did not find any instances of this. So that basically means that there was no long-distance dispersal of those rhizomes. So the spread of Phragmites, both native and introduced, is likely happening by seeds across these long distances, which makes sense. If you imagine those seeds are tiny little things that can get caught in wind and move far distances versus these chunks of rhizomes. These here are probably about this big or about that big. It'd be hard for them to move long distances unless humans are helping them out. Now, the most interesting results of our research were that when we compared introduced to native Phragmites, introduced Phragmites is spreading much more by seeds. And we have 5 different things that I'm going to point out here. If you're familiar with genetic techniques and analysis, then you can pay more attention, or you can just keep this main point in mind if that's kind of as far as you want to go. But the 5 points of indirect evidence that help us lead, or that help us conclude this is, okay, first of all, we found of all of our different leaf samples that we collected, there are many more genotypes in our introduced Phragmites versus native Phragmites. So 76% of our samples were genetically unique for introduced Phragmites, and 33% were genetically unique for native Phragmites. So a lot more diversity in the introduced Phragmites. Also, we found similar findings at the population level with these couple of different ways of analyzing the genetic data, more polymorphic loci and expected genetic diversity for introduced versus native Phragmites. Another thing we looked at was when you have a large stand of Phragmites, how large are those clones within a stand? And so one of the things that we found is that actually native Phragmites has much larger clones, which means that, so these are 5 different or 6 different sampling points I took along a large Phragmites stand, introduced or native Phragmites. And I found that the sample from here and the sample from here was actually genetically identical. So that tells me either we've got rhizomes growing this whole distance, which is very, very far, or that these rhizomes are dispersing across these smaller distances. But basically, on the whole, native Phragmites had much larger clones, so clonal spread was much more important versus introduced Phragmites, again telling us that seeds matter more for introduced Phragmites. And you remember I mentioned that gene flow among introduced Phragmites was a lot greater than native Phragmites, which is, again, an indication that introduced is mixing a lot more by pollen and or seeds. And for those of you who remember back to introductory biology, we found evidence of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium for introduced Phragmites, which is a result of random mating. So again, another point of evidence leading to spread by seeds much more in introduced Phragmites. Okay, so those are all the genetic findings that we had, but why would you even care about this? Again, a lot of folks have been asking me about how best to control this species, and the predominant way that people are controlling Phragmites is to actually spray it in the fall to control this introduced subspecies. So if you're spraying it in the fall, this plant has already produced millions and millions of seeds that year. So you might go through and be able to kill off a stand that is existing right then, but out in the general environment around that stand, you've got millions of seeds that will basically can just come back in subsequent years. So I've been chatting with folks about other alternative management strategies such as mowing Phragmites stands to keep it from producing seeds in a particular year as they get a hold of existing stands through herbicide spraying. And so there are some managers who are actually going to be trying different combinations to keep it from producing seed in a given year, and then also try to kill off stands of Phragmites by herbicide spraying. Okay, so now I'm going to talk very briefly about a couple studies that are ongoing and just give you a little bit of a sense of what we're doing. So I should give you some context for when I moved to Utah. I was coming from the Chesapeake Bay, and before that I'd been working in prairie pothole wetlands. And I really had not spent a lot of time thinking about water, lack of water in wetlands. It was just not something that was part of the framework that I was looking at things. And I remember early on, actually, Joanna and her graduate student, Rebecca Downer, interviewed me for part of Rebecca's master's thesis. And they kept asking me about, well, so what do you do if you don't have enough water for wetlands? Or when do you know if you don't have enough water for wetlands? And these were things that I just really had not thought about. But clearly, here in this region, these are very pressing issues. So this has been a new line of research for me to try to have a better understanding of what are the effects of drought and water scarcity on wetland plant communities. And as I started teaching my wetland ecology class, I kept looking for interesting studies to use and primary literature to include, and I just found that there was generally a lack of studies looking at the impacts of drought on, at least particularly for wetland plant communities, my focus. And so that's been a real impetus for me to try to particularly try to do some research in our locale, because I was not able to find much in the Great Salt Lake area at all. So one really nice and important place that can be a good case study is the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge. And as many of you probably know, the refuge is divided into many wetland units. And it's an interesting place to study drought and wetlands, because in any given year, the refuge will likely not have enough water to flood all of its units. And so in February or March every year, the refuge managers get together and they decide what units they're going to flood. And they will prioritize units based on whether they were flooded the previous year, where birds are nesting, and where they need to do maintenance and so forth. So basically you have all these different wetland units that have different histories of drought because they haven't been flooded for, maybe they weren't flooded 2 years ago, or maybe they haven't been flooded at all for the last 5 years. So I've been interested in what have been the impacts of this lack of water on the wetland plant communities. And my first look at the impacts of lack of water on wetland plant communities was to look at the seed banks. And so basically, in the early spring, you go out and you collect, you hire 2 very strong men to help you out when you're 6 months pregnant, and go out and take lots of soil cores in the wetland areas. You take these soil cores back to the greenhouse and you grow out and you look at what comes up from the soil. So why would you study seed banks? Basically, this is the potential of a wetland plant community to recover after a disturbance. So because many of these species store their seeds in their soil. So I don't have the data yet because we just finished the greenhouse work, but to give you a sense of what I'm looking for, I particularly am interested in threshold effects of drought. So at what point does a drought become so severe that you actually see a decrease in species diversity, species richness? We've got a lot in ecology. We've got a lot of different metrics for describing the plant community. And so when do you see this, or do you ever see a particular threshold? So I'm going to be classifying the different wetland units in terms of a drought index that takes into account how many years in the past 20 years has it not been flooded. We've got some really nice flooding records from the refuge. So this is what I'm hoping to see, and in the next few weeks I'm actually going to be analyzing these data. So the management implications are really how much drought is too much drought, and that's a question that a lot of people ask me, because often that is when is something when is a wetland no longer a wetland because it doesn't have enough water? That's kind of the fundamental question. And and I'm looking for these thresholds. I just did this initial study looking at seed banks, but there'll be other factors that I hope to evaluate in the future, such as cover of invasive species, cover of native species, and so forth. Okay, so finally, I want to talk very briefly about a review and meta-analysis I'm doing with a number of different folks, some of whom are involved with, or many of whom are involved with our NSF grant. Again, when I went to try to teach about drought in wetlands a couple years ago, it was hard for me to synthesize what was out there because it seemed like studies were kind of all over the place. And so that was our motivation for surveying the literature to see what have people done in other regions and what does the literature generally say. So we have surveyed 100 or evaluated 157 studies. Rebecca Downer, my technician, has been doing most of the grunt work on this. We had a number of different questions that we wanted to address. Generally, from these 157 studies, we wanted to get a sense of where are these drought and wetland plant community studies conducted, and what type of wetlands, and for what are the motivations for this research. How do people define drought, and how do they evaluate it in research experiments? And then with a meta-analysis, where basically we're taking the data from all of these different studies, can we come up with some sort of synthesis in terms of what the known effects of drought are on wetland plant communities, and do we see thresholds emerging from across a wide range of studies? We want to take these results and try to provide better guidance for management in the face of we are in a drought-prone region, and it's only going to become worse with human-induced water scarcity and climate change. So looking to the future, what can we recommend? So I'm going to talk about results from those first couple of questions. And these are just generally some summary statistics about the studies that we've been looking at. The vast majority of them are in North America. That's not too surprising because we're focusing on the English literature. Most of these studies were conducted in humid and or temperate biomes. Very few of them were actually in semi-arid or desert biomes, which in a way is somewhat unfortunate because there's really not very much to help guide us here, where some of our wetlands are in a more semi-arid environment. The vast majority of the studies were in palustrine wetlands. So these are your typical non-tidal wetlands, your marshes, playas, salt marshes, swamps, as opposed to estuaries or wetlands associated with perennial streams and rivers. 89% were in freshwater wetlands. Interestingly, quite a few of the studies didn't actually give a sense of what the water sources were for the wetlands, whether precipitation dominated, groundwater dominated, or what. So that was a little bit surprising. The vast majority of the studies evaluated just one drought event, but as we know, it's usually the cumulative effect of many droughts that you start to see a strong ecological impact. So that limits its relevance to what you would actually see naturally. Also, only 38% of the studies looked at drought with other factors such as high temperatures or high salinity levels. And again, from what we know generally about how plant communities respond, it's not just drought in and of itself, but it's drought in conjunction with elevated salinity levels or other factors that really start to have a negative impact on wetlands. So that's somewhat surprising. What were the motivations? Most of the researchers were academics, not too surprising because this was solely looking at the peer-reviewed literature. The vast majority of studies were trying to test general ecological theories and relationships between water levels and plant communities. And in fact, a very small fraction of them were actually using these studies to improve management, which to me is, again, somewhat unfortunate because that's really what people need in our region is how do you take this research and apply it and come up with useful recommendations for managers. One of the other things that we wanted to know about was how drought is defined and used in the literature. And again, there was a lot of different terminology in terms of how people describe drought. Sometimes they talked about a drawdown, just a lowering of the water levels. drought per se, desiccation, drying, percentage of exposed surface. So there was a lot of variation in the terminology people were using in terms of how people define drought. Again, there was not. I mean, these are all logical ways to define drought, but there was not a lot of consistency across studies. And I think the most interesting part of this was a third of the studies did not actually, even though they were studying drought, did not define drought in their publications. So that's a little bit unfortunate. About 20% of the studies actually looked at thresholds and, again, defined thresholds in many different ways. And in terms of recommendations for what I would like to be able to tell people or be able to assist managers with is having an understanding of where these thresholds are occurring. So that's something that we're going to be trying to do with our meta-analysis. So those are some preliminary results from those first two questions, and over the next few weeks, we've just embarked on this meta-analysis to try to actually quantify the known effects of drought, and then we're going to be summarizing what we find and discussing the synthesis and the review and meta-analysis and try to provide useful recommendations, particularly in the face of climate change. So just to summarize for this review and meta-analysis that we're doing, at this point, I think there is a need for more studies in drought-prone regions such as our own, and also in saltwater and brackish wetlands such as wetlands of the Great Salt Lake. There is a need for studies looking at multiple drought events because that's what happens naturally often, and looking at the interacting factors between drought and other important factors as well as thresholds, and looking at management or climate change implications. I was really very surprised at how few studies were really thinking about this in a management context or a climate change context. And it seems like there is a need for a more consistent definition of drought and how people approach evaluating drought, at least for ecological studies. And I think definitions of drought become even broader when you work across disciplines, as we've discovered from conversations with Joanne and David Rosenberg and so forth. So that's just an overview of the types of research I've been doing in terms of using ecological studies to help inform management of wetlands, wetland plant communities in this region, and particularly with my research looking at the mechanisms of Phragmites, invasion in Utah and the Intermountain West, and then the effects of drought on wetland plant communities. So with that, I will end, and I think I might have a few minutes for questions. So anybody has questions or not?
You gave the list of definitions for drought.
Yeah.
It seemed like they were all over the place.
Yeah.
Did any of them make the distinction between drought that was human caused, had some sort of human influence to it, versus just, or not, or was it just there's just this lack of water now for some reason or another?
So a lot of these studies, well, half of them were experimental. So they were human-caused drought in that they were doing an experiment. And then the other half of the studies were actually observational. Becca, I don't know if, do you have any more insights into what?
Try to figure that out.
I think that's one of the things that's interesting and challenging is, so managers do use drawdowns as which is imposing a drought on a wetland. But how do you define that? It's used in many different ways, very short time scales, very long time scales, and when does that become similar to a short-term drought versus a long-term drought that might occur naturally? So there's kind of trying to match up the management actions with what you might see without human influence, I think is one of the ways we need to reconcile these definitions and approaches.
Refuge have an idea of what kinds of plant communities will come back in a certain marsh area? I mean, do they have any record of well, we kept this dry so many years and this is the community we got back, or?
It's for
Is that why
the
they
vast majority of what they know is just observational. I mean, they don't generally go out and do plant community surveys every year, for instance. They've got records on water levels and then a general sense of what they think will happen in terms of their plant communities, but not really any sort of longer term study, which would be helpful. So, and I think I see that as being somewhat of a challenging situation because of what just happened, which is they had a biologist there for eight years or so, Bridget Olson, and now it's turned over to somebody else. And for me coming into this region too, trying to get a sense of what the relationship is between this water management and their plant communities, there's no written record. It's all in people's heads. So it's kind of fly by the seat of your pants. So how do you transfer that knowledge over to a new wetland manager? How does Howard Browers know how to best manage for their target plant communities? I think it's challenging, for sure. Jack.
So on the native, non-native Phragmites topic, what are the big issues? Why should I care? As Joe Sixpack.
So native Phragmites, I like to say it plays well with its neighbors. So it basically, it's not an aggressive plant, and so it co-occurs with lots of other different plant species. And in terms of habitat value, I can imagine that you've got a diversity of different plant species. You've got different structure in terms in the habitat for different bird species, for instance. You've got different seeds being produced for different birds and so forth. When you have Phragmites, the introduced form of Phragmites come in, it basically takes over everything, and you end up with just gigantic stands of Phragmites. It's often often 10, 15 feet tall, and you'll get hundreds of acres of this, thousands of acres of it. And in terms of habitat value, there are some species that can use it, but their seeds are not particularly nutritious, so it's often replacing species like alkali bulrush, which is one of the most important food plants for migratory birds. So you don't have, we've got millions and millions of birds coming through every year, and they aren't able to meet their nutritional needs because their food sources are existing in fewer and fewer areas.
So is it an issue which is related to dry water management, or is it an issue that will be a consequence of water management, but won't? Is it a sufficiently compelling issue that it will drive water management decisions?
It kind of depends on where you are and what the goals are, but certainly at the refuge and other places, other state waterfowl management areas, this is a huge, huge issue.
Okay.
So I just put together a research proposal through the Fish and Wildlife Service to look at different control strategies for Phragmites, and I called up Ducks Unlimited, I called up the Intermountain West Joint Venture, I called up the state waterfowl management area managers, and all of these folks this is high on their list of, in terms of what is threatening their wetlands, lack of water, and Phragmites is way up there. So, Lorianne, did you have a
I know it's very high up on the Utah Lake folks.
Yeah.
They're getting a lot of watershed restoration initiative money to try different things. They're trying to burn it and chop it and drive over it when it's frozen and
spread the heck out of it.
Spread the heck out of it. Yeah, all sorts of things. So they're talking about it a lot too, for sure.
Then last question on your wetland research, where you're looking for thresholds.
Mm-hmm.
Is it likely that you'll identify thresholds there that can be linked with regulatory concepts like no net loss, and identify such that one could evaluate water management decisions and say X set of water management decisions have unacceptable consequences that would result in no net loss, and therefore these water management decisions cannot be made consistent with existing law? I mean, it does.
If I had
does
the
it
power, yes.
ultimately get, I mean,
Yeah, no,
we're
but
so used to living just in this world of science. It depends. It's gray. It's
no, no.
and then other people want to. Well, no. Can you tell us what to do or not do?
Right.
Will
So,
it eventually lead to that?
So no net loss, basically, you have to know whether something is a wetland or not. And the way that they determine if something is a wetland is they're looking for presence of water, they're looking for wetland soils, and they're looking for wetland plants. Your wetland plant communities can't persist because they're not able to regenerate. Well, in the example that I was using, I was looking at seed banks. So if year after year, you've fundamentally changed the water regime such that the plant communities can't exist, then you no longer have a wetland. So yes, if you have pushed the drought to so far to the left in terms of severity, and you fundamentally impact whether you have a wetland plant community, you're missing 1/3 of the criteria that they use to look for wetland plant communities. Do I have the power to drive that? No, but if somebody came and asked me, or if my research was out there, and this could be one of the many things that people use to.
Okay, so I don't even know this. So existence of plants or presence of plants is full on. That criteria has to be met.
According to the EPA, according to wetland delineation and EPA criteria, there's it's a bunch of regulatory jargon, but you basically have to go through this list of criteria, and one of the criteria is hydrophytic plants, so wetland, water-loving plants.
We should probably roll over, give Joanna the full second half.
Oh, right. Forgot to even had it on.
Then I have to put it in the pocket or something. Oh. Thanks. Okay, we're going to switch gears now because we're going to talk about a species that you can't spray with herbicides, mow, burn, chop, stomp on, or take a core sample of. So we're going to talk about people now, and the title of my talk is Conceptualizing and Analyzing Human Hydrologic Interdependencies. And I'm going to start by talking about the conceptualization part, although I'm going to go through this real quick because I understand that this is going to be somewhat the topic of our retreat on Saturday, and I'd already prepared this, so to be true to the title, I want to run through things so you know how a social scientist, human dimensions person looks at the world. So just what do policy, social, human dimensions, whatever title you want to put on, scientists do anyway. Inquiring minds in this room might want to know. I was hoping Phaedra would be here, and because she was asking some questions at an earlier one session that we had. But real quickly, we study human populations, and we study individuals, groups, environments, both natural and socially constructed, that those species humans live in. We analyze human populations at various scales, and so the scale question that is important to ecologists is important to social scientists too. We investigate human behavior as well as conceptual, symbolic or ideological systems to understand how those systems work, how they change over time, what the processes are, how they're connected. We also seek to understand human adaptability. And there are two kinds of adaptability that we talk about with people we're interested in. We're interested in ecological adaptations that people make, how they interact with or adapt to their physical environments or their habitats. But we're also interested in their social, cultural, political, economic adaptations because they interact with and adapt to each other as well. We're real interested in examining the range of variability in human systems, in part to understand what has and hasn't been sustainable. And so there's a lot of comparative work that's done that looks at historical variability through time and different variability through space, geographic variability. And we observe and research people, but we also interact with them in the process of doing that, utilizing various techniques, such as those listed here, that yield both qualitative and quantitative data. And this is an important distinction to make. Sometimes social science qualitative data is not seen as valuable as quantitative data, but people look and talk about the world in numbers as well as in words. And so in order to adequately characterize people's own ways of knowing and behaving in the world, we have to understand it in numbers and in words. And we're interested in trying to develop understanding of people's behaviors using, and we'll talk about this more, frameworks, theories, and models, and conducting, at least for those of us who work with you in College of Natural Resources or cross-disciplinary kinds of projects, we're real interested in looking at contextualized applied research, trying to understand human behavior in relationship to the environment. So I think that's why we're in this room. Let me give you just a little diagram of how I understand human hydrologic interdependencies. This can be used for understanding human-environment interactions too. But humans interact with hydrology and with the environment according to natural laws, as any other species would. We're subject to genetics, disease, population kinds of pressures, chemical, biological laws. But in addition, we interface with our environment or with the hydrology through powerful tools that we have, science, technology, and language, through behavioral systems that we have developed, and through conceptual systems, ideologies, beliefs, and values. So humans not only respond to or adapt to the environment, but they act upon it in ways that other species don't. And this is a very iterative process over time. But humans, and here I'll bring the issue of scale back in, don't interact just individually with the environment. They interact, all individuals are embedded in other scales of decision-making and social organization, families, households, political units, and they interact with the environment, different resources within the environment, and the systems that those resources are embedded in. So these interactions that people have with the environment are very dynamic. They lead to dynamic, evolving systems. And so in looking how this all works over time, from a policy and social science point of view, we're really interested in how it unfolds over time. There's a lot in the literature of the policy literature about path dependencies and how it is that the legacies of past decisions we've made and the things that we've done with the environment shape the present and the future. But people are also driven to interact with the environment by the visions, plans, models that they have of the future. When you talk with humans about models, it's the models that we create, you know, to decide what the city's going to look like or what something's going to look like in the future. And with people, these models could be about this world or what's going to happen after. And that influences the way they act. It influences their ways of knowing, and so they're interacting with the world as it is, as they perceive it to be, and as they understand it to be, as well as how they want it to be. And so it makes our work actually very interesting because we have such an interesting species to look at. There are a few distinguishing features of the ways humans interact with their environments, or with hydrology in particular that we're talking about today, that create analytic challenges. And I bring them to your attention because I think that these are some of the challenges of the human species that make it difficult for biophysical modelers to integrate humans into their models. Humans have really complex survival strategies that's influenced by decisions at multiple scales. They manipulate their environment. They attempt to manage their own life cycles. They observe the strategies that other humans employ, and they adjust their strategies accordingly That's the whole underlying basis of game theory. They defy the resource limitations of their immediate ecosystems through their mobility and exchange. We don't have to move by connecting rhizomes. We have much more powerful means to move around the globe. Humans' optimization strategies, I think this is a real important one, include equity concerns as well as efficiency concerns. And there's a lot of trade-offs here in trying to optimize different outcomes for the future. Humans are different than other species. They store resources and they transmit them intergenerationally. So, you know, for plants where water or carbon that they've used returns to the system, with humans that might not necessarily be the case and be available for other humans to use. It depends. And humans are, above all, highly adaptable. To use the famous monk phrase, it's a blessing and a curse. It's a curse because they're so adaptable that, you know, problems are created. It's less often seen as the blessing that they can understand what they're doing and modify their behavior accordingly. And so we have to keep that in mind, that it has both those capabilities. So one of the important things, because of humans' highly adaptable nature, is they adapt to the different contexts they are in. This is the whole interest that people have in geography, and the reason that National Geographic is such a popular magazine, because we understand how cultures all over the world differ and how they vary because of the context, the specific context that they've adapted to. So it's real important to in understanding people's interactions with the environment and with hydrology to contextualize that and to be clear about when and where we're talking about what human population is interacting with what aspect of the environment. These are the easy parts of it that we can often get data on to model and to work with. The hard parts of it are understanding exactly how and why they're doing it. And that requires different kinds of research techniques. So humans are linked to water in various ways. In this instance, I'm going to talk about some examples related to the hydrology of the Bear River Basin. So in this part, I'm going to deal with the second part of the title, Analysis, Conceptualizing and Analyzing Human Hydrologic Interdependencies. So here's some research examples that are from the Bear River and the Great Salt Lake watershed. The first example, I think, is an example of applied interdisciplinary science. And this is the urban landscape water use analysis and assessment tools to promote conservation that we've worked on over the years. And I've worked on this mostly with Christopher Neal and Roger Kelgrim. We've had a couple of different projects over the years together. We've had a number of different graduate students. And we're looking to further collaborations with other people. David Rosenberg and Arthur Kaplan are two that we're looking at for some other projects. But what I'm going to talk about here is some of the projects we've already done. The focus of this work is on urban water use efficiency, and in particular, water use efficiency on urban landscapes. And there are different ways for achieving landscape water use efficiency. One way is to promote efficiency on existing, we'll call them legacy landscapes, ones already there that haven't maybe been transitioned or initially implemented with low water use landscapes. Or there could be transitioning to native or low water use landscapes, and there's a big push for that to increase urban water use efficiency. The approaches and sort of the research objectives that we've had in pursuing this work is to do observational studies to seek to explain variations in urban landscape water use patterns. We've done some intervention studies where we've actually done experiments in trying to alter landscape water use and to assess the effectiveness of various types of conservation approaches. And our scientific inquiries in this regard all relate to understanding the human component of urban ecological systems, and especially in relationship to urban engineered water systems. The methods that we have used is, here's a general overview, is that the basic steps in this work has been to identify landscaped area from overflights and measurements that we've taken on urban lots, similar to the photos that Karen showed you of wetlands, the same types of signatures from Chris's overflights we've been able to use in urban environments to differentiate hardscape from landscape and landscapes of different types, trees, shrubs, grass. We've integrated this information with reference ET for particular locations to estimate landscape water need, given the landscapes that's there. Integrated this with multiple municipal water billing data to compare actual landscape water use with landscape water need, and then to categorize the results on some scale of efficient to wasteful. We've used two different approaches in this regard, one a threshold approach and more recently an indexing approach. And then we, knowing this is a great thing for social scientists to have some independent measure of people's behavior or some kind of assessment other than what they tell you, we then interview and interact with water users to better understand their water use patterns and then to work to design appropriate water conservation strategies. So we've developed this Urban Landscape Water Index. It's derived from this classification of the remotely sensed airborne multispectral imagery that I mentioned, and from localized reference ET rates, and then we modify it by the actual correction factors for the landscape that we find. And this index compares estimated landscape water use to estimated landscape water need per unit of landscaped area on a site-specific basis. And the reason we think this is interesting is it allows us to assess landscape water use in an urban environment based on some standard of ecologically appropriate water use, and not just based on what any one household uses in relationship to other households. Because on that basis, if everyone wastes, then it's not as good of an independent assessment of what would be appropriate water use. And this then enables us to identify locations with what we're calling capacity to conserve. So we have done this for a number of projects. Most recently, we've developed a software tool. This is Adrian Welch's thesis that automates this analytic process and provides this user interface to facilitate the mining of these various databases and to spatially view the results. And so this is just a conceptual flowchart of what happens in the software, how it connects different types of databases that we get from the overflight, from the city billing data, from property boundaries, and then how it can color code different households based on what at least our bird's eye view initially assesses as their water use patterns. So we'll go past that. This is interesting though, because but it allows an initial cut, so you can take a little bit more careful look. There are problems with water billing data. There are broken meters. There are non-functioning meters. There are errors on either side, but it can at least help us find where there are some possible overusers, and in some future work, we're going to take this as a first cut and then get a little bit more detailed information in surveys with people of occupancy and, what they're really using their landscape for. Well, anyway, what we're finding out through all of this is an attempt to look at residential landscape systems, how they're embedded in urban ecosystems, and they have these various factors related to them. We're realizing that efficiency is a combination of various factors. It depends on the site, the irrigation technology, the plant material, as well as the human behavior. And that it requires real contextualized systems thinking and understanding human linkages to landscape area. There's an amazing amount of variation in what happens on any individual landscape, and a lot of different challenges to being efficient. Some can be efficient, some can't. And we've tended to think of urban water waste as being always the result of human behavior, but it's human behavior in a context. And some sites, some situations, we've got a phrase, situational waste, are not conducive to efficiency, no matter how much the people attempt to be conserving in their behavior. So we're kind of looking at these direct relationships between people's behavior and the environmental context within which they are embedded. We've also developed some tools for monitoring change. If we could sort of assess these indices on an annual basis and watch how people move. The baseline index is on the x-axis here, a response index is on the y-axis, and depending on how many years or any one year you use to consider that, you'll see that we're trying to characterize households. Some households start and remain efficient. They may never have needed interventions in the first place. Some start and remain unnecessary. Whatever we did in intervening with them didn't make a difference. And some start moving in the right direction by decreasing. Some, who knows, our intervention could have messed them up and they actually increased their water use as a result. So we've used these tools to also reflect on water conservation programs and interventions and evaluation tools to see what should be done in terms of further interventions with households that could conserve and what would make those interventions more effective. So we found a lot of interesting things. Landscape water waste actually is not widespread. Every study we've had, about 30% that we can determine overuse, and by quite a bit, but most people are fairly efficient. The way you administer conservation programs varies a lot. There's differences between volunteers and recruits. How you characterize conservation success is related to people's initial capacity to conserve. It's not easily characterized. Someone could be very wasteful, save lots and lots of water, but still be very, very wasteful in terms of the appropriateness of the water use related to the plant water needs. So we've worked on trying to look at that and how you would evaluate it. We've also learned that water efficiency is not a one-stop shopping, one intervention kind of approach. It's really an iterative process that people go through and changing as their landscape changes to respond to that and to try to be efficient as the landscape grows or matures. Overall, the utility this has for management is we think that the approach to sort of profiling customers and then to targeting conservation programs to the appropriate location instead of just very broad-based generalized programs could be helpful, and that careful monitoring over time, we're looking at tools to provide that. And then it also provides information on how do you design water conservation programs to fit the needs of various types of users. So that's that whole urban water conservation kind of example of research that we've been doing. Okay, the second one is a case study of responding to drought in the Bear River Basin. This was part of the drought management project, and actually I like to thank Dan and Bob. They helped participate in this project, both active in the water user community in the Bear River Basin, and it's nice that they're here today. Wallace Gibson was the head of the Bear River, or the engineer for the Bear River Commission for many, many years, and he noted that the Bear River is a stream of geographic and political complexity. It's a river that's highly variable over time. A lot of you know the features of the river, how long it is, how it goes through 3 states, the administrative difficulties of dealing with it. And in 2004, the Bear River hit a historic low in terms of recorded periods of drought that was the worst since the 1930s. Going into that year and anticipating a very scarce water year, water managers were scared that there'd be conflict related to the drought. But in the end, there wasn't much, and they were surprised by the cooperation that occurred in response to that drought. And so their response was deemed successful, and people were really pretty excited that they made it through, relieved more than anything, without more conflict, because, as we all know, with the famous phrase, water is for, whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting over, right? Whose quote is that? Yeah. Mark Twain's favorite quote. So people would anticipate conflict. But the successful response to the drought was built upon and entailed modifications of the law of the river. And so we looked at the story of what had happened there and how it had been done. We interviewed a lot of people, and there were some fairly consistent things that came out in the interviews on the specific innovations that led to what was characterized as success. One was the voluntary settlement agreement that had been negotiated between irrigators, Pacific Corps, and Bear Lake Watch, that was, interestingly enough, restated at the lowest point of the drought. And the agreement was confirmed. There was a lot of technical work in modeling and instrumentation of the river due to a lot of good work done here at Utah State University over time that allowed people to have real-time data of what was happening on the river and to consequently employ that information in communication and strategies of real-time decision-making of how they were going to make it through that particular irrigation season. We looked at the response in that 1 year against this historical context of a law of the river that had been built over time in the process of responding to previous droughts. And that's something that you can reconstruct through the history and through the way that the law of the river had been built. People changed and modified the law of the river based on what they learned about the river, its hydrology, and its variability, and what they learned about each other and what to anticipate from each other in their own responses to drought. So Karin's interested in trying to reconstruct these sequences of drought cycles with plants, and it is indeed the response to sequences of drought cycles that was the key to where people had ended up going into the 2004 drought, and partly the foundation on which they made it through. So one of the things that we used to analyze this case study was a ways of knowing framework that comes from the policy literature that looks at how people have different ways of knowing things, how those different ways of knowing are brought together, and how deliberating about public policy involves two different kinds of work. One is informational work, and that's what we are often involved here at the university, helping to get scientific information, disseminate that, but information work includes translating ideas, promoting synthesis between different ways of knowing, but it also includes relational work. So I'd say the first part, informational work, a lot of it relates to understanding the hydrology itself. The relational work is creating connections between people who represent different ways of understanding. And in this literature, there's a lot of attention to boundary spanning tools and how you bridge different ways of knowing. This diagram just kind of shows you if people have different ways of knowing something, here where they're united up to, in this diagram, how there are very diverse or multiple ways of knowing, that what you have to do to span those different ways of knowing is different. When there is agreement, you're just transferring knowledge. You're sharing the same information. Everyone's sort of interpreting it the same way. But when there are not exactly overlapping ways of knowing, but they're closely related, oftentimes translation devices are used. If there are very different, multiple and unrelated ways of knowing something, there needs to be a real transformation in understanding that occurs to allow those forms of communication to cross. Helpful for understanding what's going on in our country right now and how we're having a lot of trouble communicating. But anyway, the tools the boundary spanning tools could be objects, organizations, or experiences. And indeed, what happened in the history of the Bear River Basin is there were these kinds of boundary spanning tools that enabled people to develop more collective ways of knowing, to inform their decision making, and to help nurture the problem solving that occurred. So the drought adaptations that occurred were not only people adapting to hydrology, but people adapting to each other in that hydrologic context. And so in this regard, people's information needs included not only scientific information, but also political information emerging from their interactions from each other. So, you know, they need to know as much about each other as they need to know about water resources. And this is one of the findings that came out from, of course, talking to the people involved. It's what we came to understand about what had happened. So the way we kind of summarized this and came to understand this situation, or at least our interpretation, is that human adaptation to drought is really a highly historically contextualized process where ways of knowing the particular interdependencies of human hydrology in a place are brought to bear on solving problems of water scarcity. And we just looked at the drought here, you know, in this region. And how do you explain whether it was conflict or cooperation, and why we got cooperation? Because certainly there is a long history of conflict related to water. And our best understanding, it's a choice. People have a choice. It is not necessarily a conflict. It's a choice to have conflict or cooperate. And that choice hinges on their ways of knowing, how they're connected. In this case, how they're connected through hydrology, how one state's or one entity's use affects another, and how they're connected through history. A lot of people in the Bear River Basin have shared cultural and religious connections, so they're connected to each other in many different ways. And but the other way to understand this is the conflicts over water never really resolve. Cooperation can be described as a process of continually sizing up the next fight. This is Bob's phrase, by the way. So always knowing where you're headed. Where you've been, but where you're headed. So ways of knowing are constantly being reenacted, and that's our understanding of how it worked here. The last one that I want to mention, I guess you could call this maybe political ecology, but it's it's looking at wetland paradox in the Bear River Basin. And I just want to mention this was work that Rebecca Downer did for her graduate thesis. But we also had an interesting opportunity to collaborate with Karin, not on a research project, but interestingly enough, in putting our two classes together for the past 2 years and having a joint case study, hers on wetland ecology and management, mine on water law and policy. And we each covered things we had to cover, but we brought the classes together to look at the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge from the perspective of ecology as well as the policy. And so some of these insights come from the work that we were able to do together, and Karin served on Rebecca's committee, so I want to acknowledge that fun collaboration that we've had in looking at that. So this is the project that Karin mentioned. Rebecca was interviewing her about how do wetlands stay wet? And how do they obtain a water supply? And what pressures do they face from drought? And how have wetland managers adapted to drought? Rebecca did a tremendous amount of interviewing and archival research to look at the hydrology in the places of these wetlands, as well as how people were responding to the variability over time. She looked at 3 different wetlands, all in the Bear River Basin: Cokeville Meadows up in Wyoming, Bear Lake National Wildlife Refuge above Bear Lake in Idaho, and Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge. And what she found is that each refuge occupies a different geopolitical position on the river. And that position affects how the managers obtain a water supply and their pressures and how they've adapted. And that it's real important to understand the human parts of the river, the water rights and the users, as well as the hydrologic parts of the river, the water availability and the infrastructure. And so each refuge varied, but it was the connection that they had to both water and people who had water, if it wasn't their own, that was important. Cokeville Meadows is a refuge where the access to water is through nearby irrigators. They have no water rights of their own, or they have some that were acquired with purchased land, but a lot of that area had not formerly been wetlands, and they are irrigation-dependent wetlands. The Bear Lake National Wildlife Refuge has no water rights of its own, no formal legal water rights, and yet the analysis shows that as long as everything else in the basin stays the same, and there are powerful reasons that it should stay the same, that Pacific Corps would pull water out of the Bear, put it in Bear Lake, and bring it back out to deliver it to Bear River Canal Company. As long as those agreements are in place, it sits at a very important geographic nexus that gives it the most secure supply from the point of view of wet water of all three refuges, even though it has no formal water rights. The Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge, on the other hand, at the very end of the river, has the most secure legal water rights. They're junior priority to a lot of other rights on the river, but they're much higher in priority than the other refuges have. But that refuge, being at the end of the river, has had to develop very extensive infrastructure and monitoring management plans to deal with the limited water that they get. And their access to water has been through junior water rights, but intensive management and cooperation with upstream users, one of which is Bear River Canal Company. Dan manages that Bear River Canal Company, and Chris talked a lot about Bear River Canal Company in the talk he gave earlier, and how those wetlands are very dependent on irrigation return flow. So it's those nexus that they sit at. So the conclusions are really wetland managers must obtain water rights or agreements with other water rights holders, and the wet water and paper water, this shouldn't surprise us, they're different. That's certainly what we've realized with Native American water rights over time. Active management may be necessary to meet ecological goals, particularly in systems that are highly manipulated. And understanding water availability to the wetlands requires researching both the physical hydrology and the water use institutions that decide where that water will actually be, when, where, and for what purpose. So let me just do a quick summary and conclusion. Overall, from kind of this work that we're involved in, humans are embedded in hydrological ecological systems. Natural systems are a bit of a false distinction. Helga mentioned in a seminar she gave not too long ago that, from some of her work, especially in Europe, there is no culture without forest and no forest without culture. I would say the same about rivers, possibly. Jeff's smiling at me back there. Europeans don't talk about natural landscapes. The European framing is to talk about cultural landscapes. We have the blinders here to be able to talk about that because many of our lands are public lands. Oh, yes, I should extend the meeting, right? You know how I get rid of that? Okay, so humans are embedded. There's a need for scale-sensitive, contextualized understanding of human adaptation in the process of these evolving interactions and linkages that they have with the environment and with each other. And this implies, from our point of view, the need for conceptual and analytic integration within the scientific community. And so if you think about us and we're trying to understand how humans relate to water, the human dimensions people we look at the people, but at times we look at the water because we can't understand what people are doing without looking at the environment, right? So we kind of look over there because we're trying to explain what the humans are doing. Biophysical scientists look at the water or other aspects of the environment, and they sometimes look at the humans that are linked to it because they couldn't explain it any other way. But I think that where we're headed, or where true integration may exist, is trying to understand the linkages per se and what it is that connects humans to water and water to humans, and how that works in the real world. So that's where the human hydrologic interdependencies part of the talk comes from. So anyway, that's all I have, and I'll end it there. And I think we're going to have an opportunity to continue talking about at least some of our favorite topics, which is people, on Saturday, right? But you can't spray them or mow them or stomp on them. Don't forget it, okay? Because we have to go through IRB procedures to work with human subjects. Institutional Review Board procedures. You have to treat them very carefully. I don't think spraying them with herbicides would work, even if we think there are too many of them. Okay.
But going back to the ways of knowledge, ways of knowledge, can you give concrete examples of some different ways of knowledge that you're referring to? In the context, whichever context you want to pick from.
Experiential ways of knowledge and scientific ways of knowledge is the most obvious example. And I remember the one water users meeting where Carly Burton and Connolly Baldwin was going to get up and give us, and Carly Burton said, wait, let me give my prediction first, and then we'll see what the model says. Okay, so the guy who'd been managing the river for 30 years got up first with his prediction. And then the one with the hydrologic model got up, and they were highly consistent with each other. Of course, the models are built on people's understanding of the river, but that's one, just one way of knowing. Experiential knowledge versus scientific knowledge. There's close relationship between them. But there are other people come to know through how they think, how they feel, how they react, a lot of different ways of knowing. And there's a rich literature where there are other people that don't call it ways of knowing, but there's a very rich literature in this area about different perspectives, different framings. Did that answer? Any other questions?
So I guess I'm going to state myself as a scientific ways of knowing type person, but could the experiential and, to go to the extreme, is it the difference between sort of evolution and the sort of creationism? I mean, people could say the knowledge of how the world came about, if it's a non-scientific way, maybe it's. I mean, you gave an example